Echoes of the Old World by Jace Masters. The dust once again engulfed him as he stepped out of the relative safety of his makeshift hideout. The old supermarket had proven to be exceedingly resilient and had survived at least 3 major earthquakes and flooding over the course of the last week. Now, however, the time had come to take the last of the supplies the place offered and move on. The sound of thunder and the myriad of lights streaking across the broken skies told him that they were once again closing in, and he wanted no part in that. As another flash of red light was accompanied by a sound of thunder a short moment later, Joel couldn't help but scoff at the thought of these beings of nigh infinite power and knowledge slugging it out between themselves in what he thought came down to a lowly brawl, albeit at a global level. "At least religious wars are done," he mumbled to himself, chuckling at the absurdity as he did. Guess they were all right. The roiling storms of dust, wind, and gravel quickly obscured most of his sight, even through his thick goggles, as he made his way south. What he believed to be south, anyway. The last governmental emergency broadcast had cut out some weeks ago, and they had mentioned massive shifts in landmass and other geographical anomalies across the globe. All he had to do, though, was make it to the bunker at Fort Worth. They were still transmitting a signal, so they should still be alive in there. The security one of those bunkers offered far outclassed anything he had come across so far, especially with the encroaching signs of battle. There wasn't much left out here now. The odd derelict car, destroyed husk, or what could have been any type of building were the only signs that this had once been the bustling town filled with thousands of people living out their lives. Joel hadn't even seen another living being in 4 days now. Or had it been 5 already? Slogging his way through the desolate wasteland was somehow soothing Joel, despite all it entailed. The monotonous raising of the winds, though loud, drowned out most of the other noise, and the usual shades of brown offered a respite from the oversaturated spectacle of color humanity had gotten used to encountering on a daily basis before the world ended. Now all that remained were sand and dust, and there was beauty in that somehow. Lost in thought as he ruminated on what had to be humanity's end, Joel zoned out as his movements turned mechanical and systematic. The road was still long, and the mind goes to different places when input is rarefied. It was odd to Joel then, as he was snapped out of his trance-like state, that he noticed he couldn't hear his own footsteps on the ground below anymore. When they had gone silent he couldn't exactly tell, but they had definitely gone from him for some time. Curious as to the cause, Joel looked down to see if maybe another flood had slowly crept in, but as he did he saw nothing but deep, dark, viscous umber surrounding his Wellingtons. Alarmed at the change in ground texture, Joel slowly but surely began inching his feet forward. The liquid below seemed to give way to his movement, offering little in the way of resistance. A gentle step came next, and again the liquid obliged, allowing his foot to pass through without effort. Puzzled, Joe continued his path in the direction he had been going carefully. Step by step he passed through the liquid until he saw the opposite end of the shallow pool he found himself in. The sight at the other end caused him to stop his movements immediately and freeze in place. Before him, knelt down at the opposite edge of the pool, were 4 hulking, green-skinned creatures with pronounced brows and torn remnants of clothing. They were drinking the liquid from the edge of the pool, lapping up the substance with eager abandon. Joel had heard of people being changed by the new forces around them, and he understood that most of them were to be avoided at all cost. The sight of these creatures and their state was enough for Joel to decide that this would be one of those circumstances where avoidance was key. He slowly made an attempt to move his foot back, finding that he was somehow unable to do so. As he looked down, he saw the liquid had somehow solidified against the back of his boots, as if the substance itself did not want or allow him to back away from the creatures before him. Panicking, Joel attempted to move his other foot up and back to avoid the liquid on his step back. Again, the liquid would not allow him to move. Growing in desperation, Joel only saw 2 ways out of this predicament. Either he would have to abandon his boots, or he would have to go towards the creature on the banks of the pool and get past them somehow. They seemingly hadn't noticed him yet despite his struggling, so there might still be a chance for escape if he was fast enough. Determined not to abandon his only remaining footwear and hesitant of touching the liquid with anything but the rubber of the footwear, Joel made up his mind and got himself ready to sprint. He pulled in the straps on his backpack to tighten it to his body and leant forward, placing his weight on his front foot. He felt his heart race as he fought against the instinct to flee in any other way, tightening his muscles and pushing off towards the edge of the pool around him. Luckily, the liquid gave way this time, allowing him passage towards the creatures ahead of him. Silent, however, he was no longer. Loud splashing noises originated from below as he sped forward. The creatures, immediately alerted to his presence, began rising up one by one as they abandoned their drinking in favor of this new intriguing movement. As he sped forward, Joel braced his shoulder and hoped that his years as a linebacker in college would pay off now. As he clashed with one of the creatures a short moment later, Joel was reminded of the incident that got him removed from the team due to a permanent shoulder injury, because the feeling was eerily familiar. As he connected with the creature's barely covered emerald skin, he felt something pop and snap. It was as if he hit a wall head-on. Pain shot through him, his nerves sending out waves of searing hot agony. But Joel managed to hold on and keep going, biting through the pain now radiating outward from his shoulder. He stumbled past the creature he had clocked and kept sprinting as fast as he could without looking back. Never look back, his father had told him, because then you can't see in front of you. Silly advice, for sure, but valuable nonetheless, both back then as well as now. Joel heard the heavy footfalls of the creatures behind him. Even over the gusting wind they were audible, moreover, clearly felt in the ground tremors. The creatures must weigh a ton for their footfalls to be like that, he thought, and Joel felt lucky to still be running the way he was. By the time Joel felt safe enough to slow down his full sprint, his lungs had been burning for some time, and he could taste iron in his throat. This air was not meant to be breathed in rapidly, and sprinting should not be done with a rag over one's face ideally. As he slowed, he now felt it was warranted to chance a look back at his pursuers. He saw nothing. Nothing behind him to indicate the creatures were still following. All he could see was the same roiling storm of dust and gravel that had been around him ever since he had left his previous hideout. Scanning the area around him, he looked to see if there was a place to hide for a moment so he could catch his breath. Amid the various shades of brown, he could make out a shape in the distance, fairly rectangular and long. A bus. Perfect! Those were generally easy to get into and provided at least some shelter if intact. He ran over and began looking and feeling around in front of it for the emergency latch he knew had to be there somewhere. He noticed most of the bus's windows were shattered or completely missing, and some of the top had caved in by an impact of some sort. But as long as he would be able to hide away from the wind and those creatures for a moment, he would be happy. A number of long seconds later, Joel found the latch and pulled on it. He heard the remnants of the hydraulics attempt their best to open the doors for him, but fail. "Shit," he muttered under his breath as he moved to the doors and began prying them open with his hands. Luckily, the latch had unlocked the mechanism and had left a slight gap for his fingers to grasp onto, so with some effort on his part, he was able to open the doors and subsequently close them behind him. The inside of the bus was in little better shape than the outside. Sand had blown its way in and covered most of the floor and what remained of the seating in inches of deposits. It mattered little to Joel, however, as he immediately noticed a lull in the ferocity of the winds blowing around him, as well as an increase in overall temperature in his shielded surroundings. He instantly set out to find the best spot to rest for a bit and recuperate. A number of the seats in the back of the bus allowed for someone roughly his size to squeeze underneath in the veil of their relative safety, so he loosened his backpack, unrolled his bedroll, and set out to make a little nook for himself as quickly as possible. The process wasn't easy, especially now that his injured shoulder was beginning to bother him more and more in the absence of the adrenaline rushing through his system, but he managed to make his bedding and lie down for a moment to check on himself. As he reached in underneath his thick jacket, he gingerly moved his fingers over the area that was now thumping with intensity. He traced a path right from his neck to his clavicle and his shoulder. Luckily, the clavicle was still intact. That would have been a nightmare in these conditions, maybe even a death sentence. As his fingers reached the shoulder joint, however, the instant he touched the flesh there, his nerves were once again set ablaze. "Fuck," he murmured, trying his best to stifle the sound. He knew what this meant. In the best of situations, his arm had been dislocated and needed to be put back. In the worst, his joint had cracked or broken, and he would never regain full use of that arm without medical aid. He couldn't diagnose anything properly himself, so he just had to hope for the best and attempt to put his shoulder back in his socket. Luckily, this was not the first time this had happened, so he knew what to do. Joel moved himself up over the floor of the bus as far as he could to give himself enough room to move his arm. Laying it down in resting position, he then grabbed onto one of the brackets, holding the chairs in place with the dislocated arm, and as quickly as possible moved his body down. Pain overwhelmed his senses once again as he did, but he held on and kept a firm hold. When his arm moved over his shoulder and up beyond, he felt a familiar pop, accompanied by another shot of pain and then a lull. He released the bracket and moved his arm down once again. Something still wasn't right with the arm, but he had limited movement capability again. He'd have to get the arm checked out fully when he got to Fort Worth. Returning to his spot underneath the benches at the back of the bus, Joel laid down his head and quickly after passed out. When he came to, the sun had gone dark and the storm had seemingly passed. His shoulder still ached, and a fresh layer of sand and dust now covered Joel, but beyond that, he felt like it was in decent sorts. The bus had provided him with the shelter he much needed at that time, but now the time had once again arrived for him to leave and continue his way to Fort Worth. As he packed up his gear, he noticed the quiet around now. No noises except for the occasional gust of wind displacing something in the ruined world around him. As was customary for him to do before leaving, Joel checked his compass and watch to determine the best road to travel. Normally, they would tell him all he would need to know to proceed. This time, however, neither seemed to be of any use. The compass, that had always given him a straight north direction, now spun in place, its needle endlessly revolving around its center in a futile attempt to find magnetic north. Must be those tectonic shifts catching up to me, he thought to himself. As he put away his compass for now and moved on to the watch, another strange thing seemed to have occurred. His watch indicated it was just past noon, but the outside of the bus was as dark as night could be. He covered up his watch again and resolved to get out of the bus to see what was going on. After packing up his gear, his sore shoulder protesting but obliging nonetheless, Joel made his way to the front doors of the bus and pushed them open once again, revealing the dark quiet of the outside world. As he scanned the horizon, he then saw something that could explain both phenomena. His eyes went wide with disbelief as a landmass the size of a city floated above him, slowly and leisurely making its way in the direction of the nearby mountain range. The mass seemed to have simply been scooped out of the ground by some unimaginable force and lifted up to a new destination. Far beyond, at the edges of the city, Joel could make out some remnants of what might be daylight, but he couldn't be sure. Bet that would be a safe haven, he thought to himself, doubt about Fort Worth's security now creeping into his mind. Without the aid of his compass, Joel wasn't sure in which direction to travel, so he pondered the dilemma for some time before making up his mind. He would follow the floating city, and if somewhere along the way he would encounter another safe haven, he would then decide if it would stay there or continue. Any being powerful enough to uplift an entire city in order to keep it safe warranted following in Joel's mind. With that decided, Joel once again tightened his backpack straps, wincing as the right shoulder strap did, and continued to move along with the city. As he walked, he swore he could see more figures moving in the distance in front of him, equally keeping up with the city's slow process. Over the course of its journey from the remnants of what used to be continental Europe to its destination nestled hovering within the Crown mountain range, the floating city of Erelon became a beacon for many on the ground below. Like Joel, many other people saw the city hovering above them as a sign that there was a safe haven among the ruins of the old world. Unfortunately, not all who followed were chosen to enter the city, and many died in its wake from a myriad of causes, not in the least of which regular assaults by hordes of green-skinned, brutish creatures changed by godly influences. Those that were chosen, however, were granted a life within the city and the protection it offered, fostering a tight-knit community that flourished over the ages to come. It is still said that the gods look favorably upon the city, and that, should it ever fall, a reign of darkness would engulf the world.